So, some people have asked me to get different perspectives on the coronavirus situation. We've got Dr. Paul Cottrell on right now. I know it's going to be controversial for some people. Having done a cursory look at the history of pandemics and viruses, I can see how these things jump from pigs to birds to horses and back and forth and mutate. And I believe that something would have come out of the animal world and hit humankind like this anyway. I've also looked at the fact that there was a level 4 bioweapons lab in Wuhan where they were experimenting on this kind of stuff in preparation for vaccines. So it is paramount, I think, that people look at all of the different angles. And that's what we're doing on this channel, trying to get people on to give the expertise. So appreciate you coming on, Paul. Could you just say what your background is and what your interest in this subject is, please?
Well, I have an undergrad degree at Wayne State University, an MBA in finance, also at Wayne State University. I have a PhD at Walden University, specializing in finance, algorithmic trading, artificial intelligence using dynamic hedging. And then basically when I was doing my dissertation, my brother passed away from heart disease at an early age. He was 36 years old. So after I finished my PhD, I decided to go into medicine. So to go into medicine, you have to do a pre-med program. So I did my pre-med program at Fordham University in New York, where I live, New York City. And then I'm finishing up my master's in biology at Harvard University. And then I'll be going to medical school. So I wanted to go into, cardiac surgery because of what happened to my brother. But what interested me with this particular situation was my coursework at Harvard dealt with bioinformatics and studying genomic sequences. I did work in cancer at Harvard also, molecular biology. So I just had just an interest. So when they published the sequence from China on the Wuhan virus, I just had an intellectual interest to look at the NIH database because we were trained to use that database and do blast searches based on our bioinformatic coursework. So I just had that interest in it. So I said, well, what would it look like? So it's about 30,000 base pair RNA virus that was sequenced. And when you do a blast search, you can see other organisms that have similar homology. Well, when I did that, voila, what came out was 20 different SARS or bat SARS-like viruses that match the Wuhan. And because of my information or my knowledge in molecular biology, we learn on how to do bioengineering, with viruses, plasmids, to do lab research, cancer research, or studying bacteria or whatever, because that's what happens in a molecular biology lab. Well, I could see right away that they took the best of both worlds. We had a bat SARS-like virus and a SARS virus, and the bat SARS virus had a better replicase, which allows you to multiply the proteins and the RNA within the cell, and the SARS that had the better S-spike protein. And you could see huge chunks being copy-pasted into the genome of the Wuhan. At that time, we only had 5 sequences from China. Now we have many more because it's spread over the world, and each area has been sequencing their own. So we have a minimum of 35 Wuhan strands, and then we have one sequence that's called RATG13 that seems to have been a branch off of the Wuhan. Then there was a paper that came out shortly after I did that, early February. So I did all this stuff late January. I started January 25th. I did another analysis on January 27th. And early February was when the Indian researchers said, well, there's HIV homology in the spike protein. So I went into the NIH database, looked at the sequence. You can look at RNA sequences or protein sequences. So I looked at the protein sequences and saw the 4 insertions at the S protein, or the spike protein. And that is the protein, for ones that don't know, that actually docks into a receptor. So at that time, we knew that it was going to dock into the ACE2 receptor. So that paper kind of focused on the 4 insertions, HIV homology. I saw it, confirmed it. Fast track, to just about a week ago, talking about the RATG13, that also has the HIV homology, and that's why we think that's spun off of Wuhan. There is a little bit of stochastic changes in the RATG13 for the GAG insertion of the HIV, but it's almost exact for the glycoprotein 120. So at that time, it was like, whoa, something's not right here. This was bioengineered. And then while trying to investigate why was it bioengineered, you can kind of see in the literature going all the way back to 2010, maybe as far back as 2008, them building this up in the different research labs. And different people were publishing, and they wanted to understand why the bat is the natural host. So they kind of supercharged this virus to understand what's going on in the natural kingdom. So when someone says it's bioengineered, it doesn't mean bioweapon. But that doesn't mean that they can't use it as a bioweapon. So probably what happened, I think, because there's Francis Boyle, Dr. Boyle has said, well, maybe it was sold and it's a bioweapon. I think this is what happened. In around 2010, they were starting to modify this and add chunks and build this, what we'll call the Wuhan virus, okay? Probably around 2015, there was probably a split. While you still had, let's say, scientific discovery, scientific bioengineering, there probably was a split around 2015 where it went blackout. And so you might have had a scientific study and then this more bioweapon development thing that's going on. I've been more focused on the scientific one because I at least can track that in the literature. So you're not going to be able to track a black op, weapon system. But that's basically what happened. And over time, I've been able to looking at other research papers and other individuals that have been helping me on my YouTube channel. I kind of have a little army of 34,000 people, helping. So it's a team effort. But there are multiple receptors. It's not just ACE2. There are many receptors that have been recently discovered that this could utilize, and why there is some disparities on infection rates around the world. And that explains, like, some ethnicities will upregulate different receptors, not just ACE2. So, and that's, I think, the part of the explanation why we're seeing the explosion of infections, let's say in Iran and Italy. It's not just, it's a very complex problem. It's not just receptor upregulation. It's also sociological, how we behave in a society, but not all those factors are equally weighted. So, and I think in the mainstream, they've been focused on more of the sociological reasons, how people behave in a society, and why it was spreading. But I think that there is a very big biological component that's different, dealing with the upregulation of the receptors.
So some of your scientific vernacular has flown over my head. I imagine it has to some of my viewers as well. HIV
Oh, I'm sorry.
homology. What does HIV homology mean?
Okay, so basically what it means is that the HIV virus, one of the viruses, HIV-1, is the known virus that get, is AIDS, right? So that is a retrovirus. Coronavirus is not a retrovirus. They're both RNA viruses, but their mechanisms and how they work inside the cell when they're infected are totally different. Totally different. But you can take bits and pieces of one genome and supercharge it in another. So what they did was they took the glycoprotein 120, which is the spike protein of HIV, pieces of it, and put it into the spike protein for coronavirus. Now what that means is that it allowed certain charges, proteins are neutral. So when you have a sequence of amino acids, you'll have these like minor, or what we call partial charges, partial negative, partial positive charges, and then your receptor will have the same kind of partial charges around there. So if they're opposite, and when they dock, if they're opposite enough, then it docks well. So it's not just the topology, but it's also the opposite charges have to be correct for it to dock correctly into the receptor to come into the cell. So if you have 4 inserts, 3 of them coming for the glycoprotein 120, which is the spike protein of HIV, okay, virus. 3 separate insertions plus 1 insertion for GAG, which is tied into the capsid assembly. For that to happen zoonotically is very rare. 1 insertion, maybe 2, yeah, that might be zoonotic. But 4, and then I kept on like going, what's going on with the white blood cell drop on some of these patients? Well, there are researchers that have found, and I published on my YouTube site, that it's not just the ACE2 receptor, but it involves something called DC sign and L sign. They're two different receptors. L sign receptor is a major receptor for HIV docking of its spike protein, which is GP120, which is part of the inserts, the 3 inserts that are in the coronavirus. So what am I saying? I'm saying that there are bits and pieces of HIV that supercharges the spike protein in the coronavirus that docks not only in ACE2, but also docks on L sign receptor, which is also called CD299. And that is a major receptor for HIV.
So do you think that this was released accidentally then?
65% of let's say the scientific hat would say it was accidentally released from the P4 facility. It was definitely released by the P4 facility. The question is, was it released on accident or on purpose? 65% of let's say the intellectual pursuit here would say it was accidental due to poor safety protocols. But there's a 35% chance that it was done on purpose.
If it was done on purpose, what do you suspect the motive would be?
That's a dark road. That's a really dark road. And I'd rather assume that it was done on accident. But if it was done on purpose, it may be program calling of the population. And instituting a one health government. There's this one world government. If people pay attention to Agenda 21 or Agenda 30, part of that agenda is what they call One Health. And One Health is a global health. And then if you subscribe to the idea that it was purposely released, that, and you look at how the WHO has basically placated to China, kind of kowtowed to China, afraid to question China and their numbers and how they treated this early on in Wuhan. It makes you think that they are rolling out some sort of one health agenda. That's a subset of Agenda 21, Agenda 30. So it's probably a globalization play.
So if it is engineered like this, looking at previous pandemics, Spanish flu lasted over a year, bubonic plague lasted 5 years, do you expect this will mutate and there will be further waves?
If we look at the epidemiological curves of the Spanish flu of 1918, there were multiple waves. There was, a primary wave, a secondary wave, and a smaller tertiary wave. That's the best evidence, the best proxy that we have of what this would probably be. Now, the Spanish flu was zoonotic. This is not zoonotic. So the dynamics, it might be a fallacy to use that as a proxy, all right? I do know this. There are multiple receptors, and I called it pinballing. So if one receptor loses affinity, normally, let me backtrack. Normally, when a virus is newly introduced in a population, you'll have a spike in activity, and then it'll start to die down. It's called attenuation. So as it's attenuating through the population, it starts to weaken. The reason why is the replicase isn't very good, because viruses don't have like proofreading mechanisms like we have. Higher organisms have more proofreading mechanisms as it's duplicating its genome. So the replicase makes lots of mistakes. So there's lots of mutations. But through natural selection, it can either become very virulent, or it can normally viruses will attenuate in the population and just kind of live within the population and not just kill everything off, right? I mean, someone could just do the mind experiment. Ebola is very deadly, but it dies off so quickly that it can't learn to live in the population. Now, my fear is because there's so many receptors that this can deal with. All right, it can deal with ACE2, it can deal with GRP78, it can deal with CD147, it can deal with CD209 and CD299, and maybe others, that it'll pinball, where it'll attenuate from one, lose affinity, let's say ACE2, but gain affinity later down the road for, let's say, CD147. And so my concern here is that, yes, there will be a secondary wave and a tertiary wave, but my real worry is that it stays dormant for 5 or 6 years and then gains function and virulence and pops back up, just like how it is right now, 5 or 10 years later. And so, that's my bigger concern. I'm more concerned about what's going to happen 5 or 10 years later than actually right now.
So in the mainstream and even on Joe Rogan, we've seen doctors get interviewed who are convinced it crossed over from animals. Are there other people in the scientific and medical community that you're working with that are corroborating your perspective?
Well, here's the thing, is you can look at it 3 different ways. You can look at it from a bioinformatic way, a purely statistical way, and the paper trail. And all 3 vectors point to the same conclusion, and that is it was bioengineered. And let me give you, I explained on how it was bioinformatic, where there's huge copies, all right? You're talking, when I say huge copies, I'm talking about 2,000 nucleotide. And it took the best of both worlds. They took the best from bat SARS-like and put in 2,000 nucleotide paste, and then about a little bit more than 500 nucleotide paste for the spike protein from SARS. And then they put a cherry on the top with the 4 inserts of HIV. For all those things to be zoonotic, if you look at it from the statistical point of view, that would mean that a bat would have to have bat SARS-like virus, SARS virus, and AIDS to have them translocate. It's called translocation. For them to accidentally chunks be put in to the genome. Then it being at a P4 lab that's next to a fish market. If you add all of that up, it's probability. You got to times it. Each one of those things, it's like 0.0001% chance that all of these things could have been zoonotic. So could it have been zoonotic? Yes, but the probability is so low that to be scientifically honest, you would have to assume that it is bioengineered. So that's just the pure statistics of it. Okay, if you look at the bioinformatic of the genomes, you can see the big copy paste. I mean, it's anyone, you don't even have to have a molecular biology knowledge or bioinformatic knowledge. You just see the genomes and you can see the copy paste. All right. So you got 2 vectors that are pointing to bioengineering, because when you see something that zoonotically is changing and it gains function, you see it's stochastic, but you don't get these big chunks in the 2 most important areas of the genome, the replicase and the spike protein. That doesn't happen zoonotically. With HIV, no. So, and then if you look at the paper trail, you can see that Dr. Pyong Zhao and others were using bat SARS-like and SARS virus to understand how the bat host was the host. What was the biological mechanism and how the virus could go underneath the radar of the immune system to live with the host, so they can design therapeutics or vaccines for SARS, because this is SARS. This virus is SARS. And a lot of people don't say that they say COVID-19. COVID-19 is the disease. Okay? What is the disease? SARS-CoV-2. This is SARS. And it's not projected in the news, but in the scientific nomenclature of this virus that we're dealing with is SARS. And we know how scared and deadly that is. And they supercharged it in the lab to study it. Okay? Now, maybe in 2015 there was a black op, and we don't know, because there's no way we could paper trail that. But if you look at the paper trail of how they were building this up in the literature and publishing how the bat is the host and how SARS works, you can see this developing. You can see how this was being engineered through not all, but a lot of different labs around the world. Canada, the United States, and in China. So you can see the literature using this as kind of a model. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that this is bioengineered. So I'm looking at 3 separate vector points, and they're all the 3 separate vectors, and they're all pointing to the same conclusion: bioengineered. I wish it wasn't, but
it is bizarre that they had the level 4 weapons lab in Wuhan experimenting on this, and then the outbreak is there. Definitely bizarre.
Here's another point. Here's another point, though. A lot of researchers that have a lab, they get grants from the government. All right, and they don't want to say something that might tip the apple cart for their research. So people need to think that, well, people that are saying that it's zoonotic where is their funding coming from? And a lot of that funding that are saying it's zoonotic is usually coming from government funding. And the governments need they need this funding to maintain their lab. But not only that, the government needs their lab to possibly do the black ops. So, I mean, the point I'm making is there's a symbiotic relationship between the government and these individuals saying it's zoonotic. Because if people wake up and realize what has been going on in some of these research labs and the protocols and the ethics issues that are happening, it may shut it down. People might see. The problem is that the average citizen doesn't fully understand what is going on in these labs and how they're manipulating genomes and how deadly these things could be. A P4 or a BSL4 lab, that's deadly. That's a deadly pathogen. So, unfortunately, the scientific level baseline for our society is relatively low in this particular discipline.
So if that was released accidentally or maybe even intentionally, wouldn't that be a declaration of war on the US and my country?
Yeah. And this is what, see, if you go down the road of if you go down the road that it was purposely released, who purposely released it and why? Was it Western society that had a mole in the P4 lab and leaked it out to try to weaken the Chinese to pull down the CCP? Maybe. Because the CCP has already published that, one, they wanted to do espionage with the 1,000 Talent Plan that was published in 2008. A Harvard professor was caught with espionage with that, and some graduate students in Boston. Researchers in Canada were caught with stealing material. So maybe it was the Western countries that try to weaken the Chinese, but I don't think that's the case. Maybe it was a dissident that was trying to pull down the CCP that's actually Chinese. It's possible. Miles Go, I mean, he seems to be a potential character in this, and he seemed to have some inside information before things started leaking out of Wuhan on what was going on. So that's why I'm saying there's something's going on with the CCP, some sort of try to overthrow or something like that. Is it potential that the Chinese leaked it on their own population, knowing that maybe some of these receptors are more upregulated in Caucasians, because they are? DC sign and L sign are more upregulated in Caucasians than Asians. But ACE2 it seemed as though that more males will have it than females. Early investigation was saying that Asian males have more ACE2, but that still hasn't been fully explored. I think the power of that study is a little low, but it's possible that these receptors that we're talking about, we may be white males may actually be more susceptible to this than any other ethnicity or sex. So if the Chinese knew this, they could have done this: leak it out into the population first in China. It would spread around the world. When we start getting sick in the Western world, they would be starting to get better, and it will allow them to institute their 2025 plan, which is to control the first island chains, and thinking that the United States would be sick, they wouldn't be able to fight a Pacific battle. But that's speculative. I mean, I don't have any scientific proof. That's more kind of like more like wargaming, Pentagon wargaming than anything else. That's why I said 65% of my thinking was that it was accidentally released from the P4 lab. Definitely bioengineered. I have no doubt it was bioengineered. But the question really is why did it leak out? But I just for my own sanity, I would prefer that it was accidental, because it's a really dark road if it was on purpose. And who did it? Was it a CIA black operation to pull down the CCP? Was it a globalization move to try to institute this One Health and an enforced vaccination program? On my channel, I look at this problem multifaceted. It's the scientific, the biological, the pathogenic kind of pillar. There is the financial pillar, and then there is the sovereignty pillar, all right, or the legality pillar. And I'm seeing that one, it's devastating for our own health, but it's also devastating to the economy. I mean, we're going to go into a depression. And the whole world will go into a depression. We haven't seen anything like this before. It's like 1929 with Spanish flu all at once, right? And we have a much more interconnected world, and everything is, computerized, where everything happens faster. So everything is going to fall quicker. So we're going to go into a depression, I think. And then my concern is that it created such havoc in the economy that a lot of countries will say, we can't have that financial hardship again, so we're going to do a forced vaccination program. See, if you notice the nomenclature, COVID-19, how they name it, it's already programming in our mind that there'll be a COVID-20 and a COVID-21 and a COVID-22. So you got to go get your vaccination to make sure you save that economy. This is a war against coronavirus. See, we're already being programmed in the media to start thinking that once that messenger RNA platform is proven out for the vaccine, for this virus, I'm concerned that it will have forced vaccinations, or you can't go to work. And that's the easiest. That's the fastest way. That's the fastest way to get compliance.
It's interesting that you got a financial background. Every day, I used to work in the stock market. Every day I'm getting messages from people saying, should we buy the stock market here? And I'm saying, that's catching falling daggers, don't do it. And every day it's going lower and lower. The average bear market lasts about 9 months. So you saying you're seeing like a full-scale depression scenario, housing prices collapsing, interest rates collapsing. Could you just expand a little bit more on what the time frame is there? Sure. And if there's like a second and a third wave, I mean, we're already at the brink of collapse now. If there's a second, more virulent wave, where would that leave the global economy?
Well, I believe that this whole duration of this virus, or viruses, because it's probably multiple, is going to last 18 to 20 months. And that's basically what happened with the Spanish flu of 1918, okay? But we have a bioengineered one, so it's probably going to be more virulent in the secondary and tertiary wave. That's my guess. It could attenuate, but my guess is it'll be more virulent. Because there's multiple receptors, they'll lose affinity for one and gain affinity for another. The market, I look at the S&P 500 because I'm in the States, so it's 500 stocks. It's diversified, so you get a good cross section of the economy versus, let's say, the Dow 30, which you don't have a good cross section of the economy. When you look at the VIX index, the VIX index, we hit in this period, we hit about 82 on the VIX. Now, people that trade realize that that's a lot. So there is such a thing as acute risk and chronic elevated risk. Now, we've had a lot of things that have happened the last 20, 30 years. We had the Gulf War, Desert Storm. We had the tech bubble. We had 9/11. We had the Afghan War and the Iraq War and Syria. These were all, and then we had Lehman. These were all periods of really elevated risk in the stock market with higher VIX levels. But out of all those, only Lehman gave us an 80, I think it was an 89 on the VIX. That's very high, and we know what happened with the Lehman crash and housing prices and everything here. So those other events were more, they were more acute. They weren't chronic. Lehman was chronic, where it was elevated risk for a long time. So normally risk, it spikes for a day or two and then comes back down. It's called heteroscedastic. So it comes up and then comes down, and then it spikes again another 2 months or 3 months, comes back down. So that's when we say buy the dip, right? That's what we mean, But when it's chronic, you start having liquidity problems where a lot of assets, maybe not all, but the majority of assets the majority of the assets are falling. So it's very hard to position yourself in the economy. So all markets are becoming in disequilibrium or in a chaotic attraction, if you want to use terms in chaos theory. But the VIX is elevated, and the last time we've seen that was Lehman. No matter how much the Federal Reserve or the central banks pump into the economy, it's not going to force people to spend more when we're forced to stay at home or we're sick. The virus doesn't care about the central bank. There's no transmission mechanism. Biology does not care about finance, right? So because of that, we're not going to be able to stop the fall until this pandemic is fixed on the medical side, on the clinical side of this. Because of that, I believe home prices will start to fall. We're going to have 50% unemployment. This is going to last for 18 to 20 months because of this secondary and tertiary wave. And I'm very worried and of the creeping socialism that is starting to happen. You can see it in the news where it's like, okay, here's $1,000 a month. Here is, these massive bailouts. If you're familiar with Ayn Rand and Atlas Shrugged, it's almost like it's being played out. What happened in that book is like sort of happening today. You had billionaires just kind of going missing. There's this idea of a new coin, which we might call in our terms maybe decashing. There is this a collapse of the society, and government's coming in to try to create all these socialistic programs. Atlas Shrugged is almost like a prophetic vision of what we're living through today. Not exactly, but I mean, there's a lot of similarities. So I'm concerned about the creeping socialism, and because of that, we're not gonna have that capitalistic society that we may actually have, quote, a new normal, but it ain't capitalism. It may be socialism, and what happens with decashing? What will happen is it's like, well, we have bills and coins. Well, now everyone's afraid of COVID-19 or COVID-20 or 21. So we're told we got to get rid of cash and we got to get rid of coins, but then you're permanently in the banking system. It's almost like the banks need us to, they need that bail. It's called the bail-in, right? That's what And that's what decashing really is bailing in the banks. So there's a lot of problems, but I suspect that the S&P 500 will go down to 1700. And that will be I'll reevaluate to see if it goes down more or not. But I would not buy until it hits 1700 with a reevaluation to see if it's worth it. But right now it's around 2300. So it's not going to take that much longer to fall to that with the reevaluation. Now, maybe we're lucky. This is with the assumption that there's going to be a secondary and tertiary wave with a lot of deaths and a lot of infections. I'm expecting 165 million people being infected in the United States. And I've been throwing out like really big numbers at people like, are you crazy? In 20 months, I believe 165 million people will be infected. 5-6 of those will be mild. 1/6 will be severe. 25% of those will die. Well, if you work out the numbers, it's about 6.9 million people in the United States because of the health will have complications from COVID-19 and die from it. That's because they're obese, they have diabetes, they have heart disease, they have kidney problems, yada, yada, yada. So that's going to have a devastating economic component too. So this thing is going to echo. Once we're done with the pathogen, this is going to echo for years, into the economy before we come back up. We call the green shoots. Bernanke called it the green shoots. We're talking years before we see a green shoot, if it's at this severity. But if we're lucky, and that there is a therapeutic, there's some talk about this chloroquine, being a potential therapeutic when it's used in conjunction with antibiotics before remdesivir or a vaccine is developed. If we're lucky and we can slow that R0 value of spreading this virus, because it's around 4 to 6, depending on the data that you look at. If we can slow that down and bring it down to 1 or less, then we can, not have as much damage to the economy and potentially have an attenuated secondary and tertiary wave. But, we got to be really lucky. It's not out of the possibility. We might get lucky with it. But, the worst case in the United States, 6.9 million people die, and we're in a depression, and we're not getting out of this for about 5 years. Best case, we, are 18 months into this thing, and we have so much of a control with it, and we're talking about maybe hundreds of thousands, millions of people infected, and maybe hundreds of thousands that die from it. Which is, I think, the best case. But that's only if we're lucky with that chloroquine or some other therapeutic.
Do you think the death toll will be exacerbated because we've outsourced drug production and medical equipment production to China, and that basically now the home economies need to convert their industries into manufacturing those ventilators and the oxygen and providing everything else so that the intensive care units aren't overwhelmed?
Yeah, it's a realization that Western cultures have been outsourcing for some sort of profit maximization to lower cost centers. We have outsourced way too much our economies to potential enemies, right? Just to make sure that we're making a quarter that quarterly profit. So it's a major problem, and we're starting to see, when Trump became president, we started to see manufacturing slowly coming back into the United States. I don't think anyone had any idea on how much of our pharmaceuticals were being created in India and in China. I mean, really important, pharmaceuticals that, are life-saving, And when that supply chain is disrupted, either because of geopolitical issues or because of this pathogenic issue, Congress started waking up. We have a senator in Florida, his name's Rubio, who was a chairman of one of the committees, and he was really drilling, down during the hearing, saying, "Hey, we need to bring these pharmaceuticals back into the United States for manufacturing, and also the ventilators." I was surprised that that it's hard to be manufacturing these things in the United States. I mean, it's just we have outsourced way too much, and it's time to bring it back home. And it's this idea. When I did my MBA, we were taught shareholder maximization, complex supply chain management, design in the United States, manufacture in 3 different areas of the world, and, have it assembled and shipped. And you know what? That's a fragile system when you're talking about just in time. There's, they squeezed out the redundancy for profit, but you need redundancy to absorb shocks. I mean, would you drive your car on a road that has a bunch of potholes with no shock absorbers? No, of course not. But that's basically what we did with our economy. We took the shock absorbers off, saying that the cost of shock absorbers is too much. That's what happened. And now we hit a major pothole, and that car, we hit that, we got that G-force from that, and we're living through it. But we need redundancy. If you look at biological systems, there's redundancy when it's making chemicals in the cell and communicating with other tissues. And it recycles, but you need that redundancy. You need that ability to absorb exogenous shocks or endogenous shocks. But I mean, you need those shock absorbers. It's a sad state that the Western civilization's in, and the problem is, because you know about finance too. Those analysts on Wall Street, or even in London. They do those conference calls, and they say, well, your top line isn't, growing fast enough, and you're not cutting your costs enough. So we're going to, cut our expectations, your EPS, earnings per share, down. And, so it pushes the CFO and the CEO to reduce the shock absorber. So it's the analysts that are part of the problem. They also, they might be also the solution too, because we're starting to realize that profit maximization costs. Just because you squeeze the costs out and now you have more quarterly profits, you're going to pay it in the end when there is this catastrophic thing that happens because you created a more fragile system. So, they cause the problem, but they can be also part of the solution by saying, well, what happens if you do have these shocks? How are you going to adapt? And it forces going back to having a redundancy within the just-in-time system. So, but it is a problem. I totally agree with you. And if China decided to say, you know what, we're not going to give you your medicines because we don't like you, well, tell that to grandma who needs the heart medication, and then she dies because China didn't want to give it.
So in conclusion then, on this channel I've been saying, whether it was from a weapons lab or whether it was from the animal world, the main focus should be on preparedness. And what advice do you have for people watching this video, how to minimize damage to themselves?
Well, to be honest, in the United States, in certain regions of the country, it's almost too late. It's almost too late because we're already in what they call shelter in place. So there are rationing. there's rationing going on. Food, I live in Manhattan. Food is starting to run out at certain stores. Not all grocery stores, but like Whole Foods, which is a big grocery store chain here, they're running out of food. People are starting to hoard, so there's quotas on what you can buy. There's rationing there. Um, Toilet paper and paper products is running out. But in other areas of the United States, they don't have that problem or as severe yet. But in the high density areas, they do. So it's almost a little too late, let's say in Manhattan. But you need, it looks like the shelter in place that's happening in the United States is going to last anywhere from 14 days to 30 days. But, they use the term for the foreseeable future. Now, what does that mean? We don't really know, all right? So you need at least 4 weeks of food in your home. But it's possible that we're locked down for 8 weeks. People are telecommuting, but there's lots of layoffs, and people are worried that they're not going to be able to afford their mortgages or rent. So they're cutting expenses and stuff, and they don't have the funds for preparation. So it's a big problem now. That's why I said it's kind of a little too late for some regions, for some people. But having 4 weeks of food is really important in toiletries. But for if you're sick, you need to try to get medical care, all right? Because the doctors and nurses will have much more potent medicines, the antivirals, the antibiotics. They have a much more potent medicines that one can get. But when the medical system starts to break down, and we're already hearing signs of it in the United States, you'll only have the homeopathic to lean on if you can't see a doctor. So making sure that you are stocked up on your vitamins, your minerals, your anti-inflammatory type homeopathic remedies like turmerics, the vitamin C's. That's important for just overall health. But if you're sick, I analyzed a paper, all right, a while back, about 4 or 5 weeks ago, with some researchers that are in Europe. And it was dealing with terpenoids and lignoids. And there were 22 compounds that had in vitro, which is outside the body, proof that it killed off coronaviruses. All right. Now, there are different types of coronaviruses. Okay. We're dealing with a SARS version. Okay. There's a MERS, there's a SARS, there's the everyday benign, coronavirus. But what's unique about them is that there is an area of the genome where it's conserved, and it's called the 3CL protease, part of the genome. Well, if you have a protease inhibitor and you have a conserved region for all these coronaviruses, if you inhibit that, you slow down the replication. So these terpenoids and lignoids are protease inhibitors, but they're lower dose than the protease inhibitors that the doctor can provide. But there are off-the-shelf nutraceuticals or homeopathics that people can buy that have these compounds in it. And one of them is forskolin, the other is relora, calendula, birch bark extract, and licorice root. If you get those, and they're still available, let's say like on Amazon or other health food stores, that will help if you can't get to a doctor. I'm not saying it's a cure, and I'm not saying that it's better than what you're going to get from a doctor. What I'm saying is it's something is better than nothing when you're sick. Making sure that you have filtered water drinking fresh water. Stay away from the fluoride type waters. That is an endocrine disruptor. So having filtered water, and I take iodine supplements to just have a healthy thyroid. But those are the things that you can do, anti-inflammatory, to make sure that you reduce that cytokine storm in that second wave, and the protease inhibitors that are in natural supplements or nutraceuticals that one can get that I just mentioned, are ways to, and other antivirals that are in the homeopathic world that people know about. Thieves oil is another one. So those are things that people can get. It's not a cure, but it's at least a tool in the toolbox that people can use to try to help with fighting this pathogen. Boosting up your immune system with products like nano silver or structured silver. Sometimes people can buy products that have this nano silver in a gel or in a liquid form. That is known to boost your immune system. And if you have a boost immune system or a supported immune system, you are able to fight pathogens better. If you have a weakened immune system, obviously you'll get sicker more often. So the key is, try to get as healthy as you can before you get hit by it. It's like a charged battery. If it's fully charged and then you get hit by the virus, it goes down like this. But if your immune system is already low and then you get hit by the virus, you just don't have the energy to fight it. So it's preparation in that regard too.
So in the description box below this video are links to your YouTube channel and links to all of your socials. If people want to get a hold of you, what is your preferred method? Twitter, Facebook, YouTube?
The best way is actually on my website. They can, they can just hit the contact button and then write an email, and then, I look at that.
Okay, I appreciate your time. That's the best way. Appreciate your time. As a disclaimer, I'd just like to say that I am not a doctor. If you do have a medical situation, I urge you to consult a range of experts, not just get one expert opinion. Also, some of the people watching this video may find it extremely controversial or upsetting if they've lost people to the coronavirus already. And to those people, I just say, on this channel, we're just trying to get people on with a range of perspectives so we can come to a more informed decision to better our own preparedness for what the whole world is suffering through right now. And if you've got any other guests you would like me to interview who have perspectives similar or the opposite to what you've heard today, I will be happy to have those people on the channel as well. Just email over some contact details. So thank you very much for your time, and whatever's going down in your neighborhood, I hope it doesn't get too heavy. And
I mean, we started the lockdown where we have 100% non-essential workers in the state of New York are told not to go to work, and not everyone can commute, or telework. So the layoffs you're just starting to see layoffs happening in New York City, and we have about 23,000 restaurants that are affected. 23,000 restaurants. I mean, that's a lot. There's a lot of people that are employed in that, in bars and that sort of thing. So it's going to affect the economy for sure.